On a misty dawn in June of 1314, two armies stood poised on Scottish soil for a confrontation that would reshape the very fabric of medieval Europe. Here, near the banks of the Bannock Burn, a massive English host bearing the banners of Edward II had marched north to crush what they believed was merely another Scottish uprising. Facing them across the field stood Robert the Bruce, King of Scots, with an army less than half the size of his enemies. What the next unfolded over 2 days would not simply be a battle between nations, but a clash that would shatter the might of English cavalry and forge a legend that burns bright 7 centuries later. The road to Bannockburn began not with the clash of steel, but with the death of a king and the ambitions of another. Alexander III of Scotland had ruled with strength and wisdom, keeping his kingdom independent while maintaining careful diplomacy with his southern neighbor. But on a storm-lashed night in March of 1286, fate intervened. Alexander's horse stumbled on a cliff path near Kinghorn, and the king fell to his death on the rocks below. His sudden passing left Scotland vulnerable, with only a child heir, Margaret the Maid of Norway, to inherit the crown. Before young Margaret could claim her birthright, she too perished, dying in 1290 while crossing the treacherous North Sea. Scotland found itself without a clear successor, and multiple claimants pressed forward to seize the throne. The Scottish nobles, desperate to avoid civil war, made a fateful decision. They invited Edward I of England, known throughout Europe as Longshanks and the Hammer of the Scots, to arbitrate their succession crisis. Edward saw opportunity where others saw problem to me. He agreed, but only after the Scots acknowledged his overlordship of their kingdom. With English armies poised at the borders, Scotland had little choice but to accept. Edward chose John Balliol as king, believing he would prove a pliable puppet, but Balliol proved less compliant than expected, and when he dared to defy English demands, Edward struck with devastating force. The English army swept across the border like a flood, sacking Berwick and slaughtering thousands, stripping Edward of the symbol of Scottish independence and carrying the Stone of Destiny and royal gifts to Westminster. Balliol was deposed and humiliated, dubbed Tomb Tabard, the empty coat. Scotland, it seemed, had been erased from the map of independent nations. Yet from this darkness rose a flame that would not be extinguished. William Wallace, a young knight from Renfrewshire, raised his banner in rebellion. At Stirling Bridge in 1297, his spearmen cut down the flower of English chivalry, proving that Scottish steel could match English might. Though Wallace was eventually captured and executed with barbaric cruelty in London, his sacrifice ignited something that could never be snuffed out. The dream of Scottish freedom lived on. Into this cauldron of war and rebellion stepped Robert Bruce, grandson of one of the original claimants to the Scottish throne. In 1306, after murdering his rival John Comyn before the altar of Greyfriars Church in Dumfries, Bruce seized the crown of Scotland. Excommunicated by the Pope and hunted by English forces, he seemed doomed to fail. But Bruce possessed something his predecessors had lacked. He understood that Scotland could not defeat England in pitched battle through conventional means. Instead, he would wage a war of shadows, using the mountains and forests as his allies. For years, Bruce fought like a ghost, appearing where least expected, striking hard, then melting back into the wilderness. He destroyed castles that could not be held,
this has been an English
denying
stronghold.
them to the enemy.
Indeed.
He ravaged the countryside to deny supplies to English armies. He avoided large battles, preferring ambush and raid. Slowly, methodically, he reclaimed Scotland castle by castle, town by town. By 1314, Bruce controlled almost all of Scotland, save for a handful of English strongholds. The most important of these was Stirling Castle, the key that commanded the gateway between the Highlands and the Lowlands. Bruce's brother Edward had laid siege to the fortress, and its English garrison, starved and desperate, agreed to surrender unless relieved by midsummer. This agreement forced the hand of Edward II, who had inherited his father's crown but little of his military genius. Where Edward Longshanks had been a warrior king who led from the front, his son was weak, indecisive, and more interested in his favorites than in matters of state. His had been marked by constant reign a conflict with his barons, who despised his reliance on Piers Gaveston, a Gascon knight whom Edward had elevated far above his station. Gaveston's eventual murder by disgruntled nobles in 1312 had only deepened the divisions within the English court. Yet even a weak king could not ignore the challenge that Stirling represented. If the castle fell, English prestige would be shattered, and Bruce's position as King of Scots would be unassailable. Edward gathered the largest army ever assembled for a Scottish campaign. From England, Wales and Ireland came knights and men-at-arms, archers and infantry. The force that eventually crossed the border numbered perhaps 20,000 men, including some of the finest heavy cavalry in Europe. The contrast between the two armies could not have been starker. Edward's host was a glittering display of medieval military might, with hundreds of armored knights mounted on powerful destriers, their banners and surcoats blazing with heraldic colors. Behind them marched thousands of infantry, including the feared Welsh longbowmen whose sharrows hatted Scottish ranks at Falkirk 16 years before. Supply wagons stretched for miles, carrying the provisions and siege equipment needed to reduce any fortress that dared resist. Bruce's army was perhaps a third the size, numbering around 7,000 men. The vast majority were infantry, armed with long spears, axes and swords. His cavalry numbered fewer than 500, and these were light horsemen suitable only for scouting and skirmishing, not the thunderous charges that were the hallmark of English warfare. Yet what the Scots lacked in numbers and equipment, they possessed in abundance of spirit and purpose. These were men fighting for their homes, their families, and their freedom. As the English host approached Stirling in late June, Bruce faced the most crucial. He could withdraw decision of his career, preserving his army but abandoning the castle and allowing Edward to claim victory. Or he could stand and fight, risking everything on a single throw of the dice. The odds were overwhelming, the stakes absolute. Defeat would mean not just the loss of an army, but the death of Scottish independence itself. Bruce chose to fight, but he would do so on ground of his choosing and by his own rules. He selected a position near the Bannock Burn, a small stream that meandered through marshy ground toward the River Forth. The terrain was perfect for his purposes. Narrow approaches would prevent the English from deploying their superior numbers effectively. Soft ground would bog down heavy cavalry. Woods would provide cover and limit the effectiveness of enemy archers. Most importantly,
hold the line.
Bruce had spent
Steady
months
now.
training his men in revolutionary tactics. The traditional Scottish formation was the schiltron, a defensive circle or square of spearmen that could repel cavalry charges but was essentially static. Bruce had drilled his troops to use schiltrons offensively, advancing in tight formation while maintaining their defensive capability. It was a risky innovation that required perfect discipline and timing. As the summer solstice of 1314 approached, both armies converged on the fateful ground near Stirling Castle. The English advance was a spectacle of medieval power that struck awe into all who witnessed it. Columns of steel-clad knights rode beneath streaming banners, their war horses snorting and stamping with barely contained energy. The thunder of hooves and the clatter of armor echoed across the Scottish countryside like an approaching storm. Behind the cavalry came rank upon rank of infantry, Welsh longbowmen with their deadly yew-bows, and Irish kerns armevolins and swords. D with J. Edward himself rode at the head of this mighty host, surrounded by his greatest nobles and most experienced commanders. The Earl of Gloucester, young and eager for glory, pressed for immediate action. The Earl of Hereford counseled patience, knowing that haste could undo even the most powerful army. Yet for all their might and numbers, the English faced challenges that their king had failed to properly consider. The army's very size worked against it, requiring enormous quantities of food and fodder that strained supply lines stretching back to England. Meanwhile, Bruce completed his preparations with the methodical care of a master craftsman. Every detail had been considered, every advantage exploited. He ordered his men to dig concealed pits along the likely routes of English advance, each filled with sharpened stakes and cleverly hidden beneath layers of twigs and earth. See, these altrap traps would shatter the legs of charging war horses and throw their riders to the ground. The Scots also prepared obstacles from fallen trees and stones, creating choke points that would funnel the enemy into killing zones. The Scottish king divided his army into 4 divisions, each commanded by a leader he trusted completely. His brother, Edward Bruce, would lead the van. Thomas Randolph, the Earl of Moray, commanded the centre, while James Douglas and Walter the Steward shared control of another division. Bruce himself retained command of the reserve, positioning himself where he could respond to any crisis that might develop. This organization reflected years of careful planning and the hard-won experience of countless skirmishes against English forces. On the eve of battle, both armies settled into their camps with very different moods. The English pavilion sprawled across the fields like a temporary city, filled with the sounds of laughter and boasting as knights shared wine and spoke confidently of the morrow's victory. Many had fought in France or Wales and considered themselves veterans of proven campaigns. They saw the coming battle as little more than a final mopping-up operation against Scottish rebels who had somehow managed to avoid destruction for too long. The Scottish camp presented a stark contrast. Men sat quietly around their fires, sharpening weapons and checking equipment with the focused attention of those who knew their lives depended on every detail. Priests moved among the ranks, offering blessings and hearing confessions.
Peace be with you.
There was little bravado here, only the grim determination of warriors who understood they faced overwhelming odds but refused to yield. As dawn broke on June 23rd, the first day of battle began with an incident that would become the stuff of legend. Robert Bruce, mounted on a small palfrey and armed only with a battle axe, rode forward to inspect his positions. From the English lines, Sir Henry de Bohun, nephew of the Earl of Hereford, spotted the Scottish king apparently vulnerable and alone. Seeing a chance to end the war with a single stroke, de Bohun lowered his lance and spurred his massive warhorse into a thundering charge. The two men raced toward each other across the field, one a heavily armored knight on a powerful destrier, the other a lightly equipped king on a swift but smaller mount. Every eye in both armies fixed on this deadly encounter. At the last instant, Bruce swerved aside with lightning reflexes, rose in his stirrups, and brought his axe down with crushing force. The weapon split de Bohun's helmet and skull, dropping the English knight dead from his saddle. The psychological impact of this single combat rippled through both armies like wildfire. The Scots erupted in triumphant cheers, seeing divine favor in their king's victory. The English, stunned by the sudden death of a renowned champion, felt the first chill of doubt creep into their hearts. Bruce, ever practical, merely expressed regret at breaking the handle of his favorite axe, but his calm demeanor in the face of mortal danger inspired his followers even more. The day's fighting continued with probing attacks and fierce skirmishes as both sides tested their opponent's resolve. English cavalry charged repeatedly at the Scottish lines, only to be met by the bristling hedge of spear points that formed the schiltron walls. The narrow ground prevented the English from deploying their full strength, while the Scots used their intimate knowledge of the terrain to maximum advantage. By evening, the first day had ended without decisive result, but important lessons had been learned. The English discovered that Scottish discipline had improved dramatically since previous campaigns. The Scots found that they could indeed stand against the flower of English chivalry without breaking. As night fell, both armies prepared for the greater test that would come with the dawn. The second day would prove whether Bruce's gamble would lead to glorious victory or catastrophic defeat. The second day of Bannockburn dawned crisp and clear, the morning mist rising from the stream as both armies stirred to life. The English had spent a restless night, their confidence shaken by the events of the previous day. Edward's commanders argued fiercely about tactics, some urging caution while others demanded an immediate assault to restore English honor. The king himself seemed paralyzed by indecision, a fatal flaw that would cost him dearly in the hours to come. Robert Bruce moved among his men with quiet authority, his presence alone steadying nerves and strengthening resolve. He understood that this day would determine not merely the fate of his army, but the future of Scotland itself. Every decision, every movement, every word spoken would echo through the ages. The Scottish king had transformed himself from a fugitive hiding in caves to a master of warfare, and now came the ultimate test of his evolution. The English began their advance in the traditional manner, with massed cavalry preparing to sweep aside what they still believed was an inferior foe. But as the morning progressed, it became clear that something had gone terribly wrong with their deployment. The marshy ground near the Bannock Burn, combined with the narrow frontage between the stream and the woods, created a bottleneck that compressed their vast army into an unwieldy mass. Knights found themselves packed so tightly they could barely maneuver their war horses. The Welsh longbowmen, whose volleys had proven so devastating in previous campaigns, discovered they could not find clear fields of fire without risking their own cavalry. The very size of Edward's host, which should have been an overwhelming advantage, became a curse that turned order into chaos. Bruce recognized the moment when fortune offered her hand. Rather than waiting passively for the English assault, he ordered his schiltrons forward in a coordinated advance that stunned observers on both sides. These were not the static defensive formations that English commanders remembered from earlier battles, but mobile tactical units, moving with precision and purpose. The forest of spear points advanced like a deadly tide, each step carefully measured, each man locked in formation with his brothers. The sight of Scottish infantry advancing against the flower of English chivalry was unprecedented in medieval warfare. Traditionally, infantry waited behind defenses, while cavalry dominated the battlefield through shock and mobility. But Bruce had spent years drilling his men in this revolutionary tactic, understanding that disciplined foot soldiers could not merely resist mounted knights, but could actually drive them from the field. The English cavalry, expecting to charge against stationary targets, found themselves facing an advancing wall of steel that gave them no opportunity to build momentum. Horses reared and screamed as they were impaled on the long spears. Knights tumbled from their saddles into the churning mud, their heavy armor becoming a death trap rather than protection. The famous English heavy cavalry, the terror of battlefields from Mumbled under Wales to Scotland, CR the relentless pressure of the advancing schiltrons. Edward's longbowmen attempted to intervene, but their arrows fell harmlessly among their own cavalry, or struck the Scottish spears without effect. The confusion in the English ranks grew by the minute, as units became intermixed and command structures collapsed. Orders went unheard in the din of battle, and coordination dissolved into a desperate struggle for survival. The Earl of Gloucester, young and proud, attempted to rally the English knights for one final charge. He had argued for immediate action the previous evening, and now sought to prove his worth through personal courage. Leading a desperate assault against Bruce's own division, Gloucester fought with magnificent bravery until Scottish spears found the gaps in his armor. His death sent shockwaves through the English ranks, as one of their most noble commanders fell beneath the boots of Scottish infantry. James Douglas, the Black Douglas whose very name struck terror into English hearts, pressed his schiltron forward with relentless determination. His men moved like a machine of war, each step coordinated, each spear thrust calculated for maximum effect. The English found themselves pushed steadily backward, their formation dissolving under pressure they had never imagined possible from Scottish foot soldiers. The tide of battle shifted decisively when Bruce committed his reserves at the crucial moment. Fresh Scottish troops poured into the fighting, their war cries echoing across the field as they struck the wavering English line. The psychological impact was devastating, as English soldiers who had fought confidently all morning suddenly realized they were being overwhelmed by an enemy they had dismissed as inferior. Panic began to spread through the English ranks like wildfire. Knights who had boasted of easy victory the night before now fought desperately just to survive. The narrow ground that had prevented them from deploying effectively now became a trap, as retreat proved as dangerous as advance. Men were crushed beneath the hooves of terrified horses, trampled by their own comrades, or driven into the treacherous waters of the Bannock Burn. The appearance of what seemed to be fresh Scottish reinforcements on the nearby hills completed the English collapse. These were actually the camp followers, servants and non-combatants of Bruce's army, armed with makeshift weapons and crude banners. But to the exhausted and demoralized English troops, they appeared to me be a Scottish army arriving to complete their destruction. What had been an organized retreat became a complete rout. Edward himself was nearly captured as the Scottish advance rolled forward. His bodyguard fought desperately to extract their king from the collapsing battlefield, cutting their way with drawn swords. The man who had come north through the chaos to crush Scottish rebellion now fled southward in panic, his crown nearly lost and his reputation in ruins. The great English army that had marched so confidently into Scotland dissolved into scattered fragments. Knights abandoned their heavy armor to flee more quickly. Infantry threw down their weapons and ran for their lives. The roads south became choked with fleeing soldiers, their discipline shattered and their morale destroyed. Behind them lay a field covered with English dead and dying. Hundreds of knights, including some of the greatest names in English nobility, would never see their homes again. Thousands of common soldiers lay beneath the Scottish spears, their dreams of easy plunder turned to nightmare. The flower of English chivalry had been trampled into the mud by Scottish foot soldiers fighting for their homeland. The Scots moved across the battlefield like reapers in a harvest field, gathering the rich spoils of victory. Arms and armor beyond counting, war horses worth fortunes, and the personal effects of English nobles filled their hands with wealth beyond their more wildest dreams. But valuable than gold or silver was the knowledge that they had achieved something thought impossible. Scotland had stood emerged, triumphed against the might of England Anfant. Stirling Castle, the prize that had drawn both armies to this fateful ground, surrendered without further resistance. The garrison, witnessing the destruction of the relief force, knew their cause was hopeless. The keys to the great fortress passed into Scottish hands, symbolizing the complete reversal of fortune that had occurred in just 2 days of fighting. News of the victory spread across Scotland like lightning, igniting celebrations in every village and town. Church bells rang from the highlands to the borders as the people learned that their independence had been secured through the courage of their king and the valor of their soldiers. The dream that Wallace had died for, that countless others had sacrificed themselves to preserve, had finally blew reality through, becalmed and steel at Bannockburn. Yet victory at Bannockburn was more than a military triumph. It was the forging of a nation's soul in the crucible of war. Robert the Bruce had achieved what seemed impossible, transforming a fractured kingdom of competing clans and regional loyalties into a unified force capable of defeating the greatest military power of the age. The psychological impact rippled far beyond the battlefield itself, reaching into every corner of medieval Europe. In the immediate aftermath, Bruce moved swiftly to consolidate his gains. The wealth captured from the English army provided resources that had been desperately needed for years of guerrilla warfare. Golden coins, precious armor, and thoroughbred war horses flowed into Scottish hands, transforming the economic position of a kingdom that had been conflict white by constant. More importantly, the victory validated Bruce's claim to the throne in ways that no amount of political maneuvering could have achieved. The English survivors who straggled back across the border carried with them tales of disaster that shook the foundations of Edward's reign. The king who had promised to crush Scottish rebellion had instead delivered the greatest military humiliation in English history. His barons, already resentful of his weak leadership and poor judgment, now questioned whether he possessed the competence to rule at all. The defeat at Bannockburn would haunt Edward for the remainder of his troubled reign. Across Europe, the news of Scottish victory sent shockwaves through royal courts and military establishments. The battle challenged fundamental assumptions about medieval warfare. For centuries, heavily armored cavalry had dominated European battlefields, with infantry serving merely as support troops. Bannockburn demonstrated that disciplined foot soldiers, properly trained and led, could not only resist, but actively defeat the finest heavy cavalry in the world. Military theorists and commanders began to reconsider their tactical doctrines. If Scottish spearmen could destroy English knights, what did this mean for the future of warfare? The implications extended far beyond Scotland's borders, influencing military thinking across the continent. The age of unquestioned cavalry supremacy was ending, though few yet realized the full significance of what had occurred. Bruce understood that military victory was meaningless without diplomatic recognition. He immediately launched a campaign to secure international acknowledgement of Scottish independence, sending envoys to France, the papal court, and other European powers. The victory at Bannockburn provided irrefutable proof that Scotland was not a rebellious province, but a sovereign kingdom capable of defending its independence through force of arms. The Declaration of Arbroath, crafted 6 years later in 1320, would echo the spirit forged at Bannockburn. Its stirring words proclaimed that the Scots would never submit to English domination, that they would fight for freedom as long as 100 remained alive. This was not mere rhetoric, but a statement backed by the steel of Scottish spears and the memory of English knights lying dead in Scottish fields. The transformation of warfare demonstrated at Bannockburn would accelerate in the decades that followed. Infantry formations grew more sophisticated, combining spears with crossbows and later with primitive firearms. The Swiss pike squares that dominated European battlefields in the following centuries owed their tactical ancestry to the schiltrons that Bruce had perfected. The military revolution that would eventually sweep away medieval knighthood had its roots in the muddy fields beside the Bannock Burn. For Scotland, the victory marked the beginning of a golden age of independence. Trade flourished as merchants no longer feared English raids. Culture blossomed as bards and chroniclers celebrated the heroic deeds of their warriors. The University of St Andrews, founded in 1413, stood as testament to a kingdom confident in its future and eager to take its place among the learned nations of Europe. The legacy of Bannockburn transcended mere military history to become the foundation myth of Scottish nationhood. The story of a small nation standing against overwhelming odds, of ordinary men achieving extraordinary things through courage and unity, resonated through the centuries. When later generations of Scots faced challenges to their independence, they would look back to that June morning when their ancestors proved that freedom was worth any sacrifice. The battlefield itself became hallowed ground, a place where pilgrims would come to remember the moment when Scotland earned its place among the free nations of the world. The waters of the Bannock Burn still flow past fields that once ran red with English blood, a quiet reminder that even the mightiest empires can be humbled by the determination of those who refuse to surrender their liberty. The fields of Bannockburn fell silent as the summer sun set on June 24th, but the echoes of that miraculous victory would thunder through the ages. Robert the Bruce had gambled everything on 2 days of desperate fighting, and Scotland had emerged triumphant against odds that should have crushed any hope of independence. The impossible had become reality through courage, cunning, and the unbreakable will of men who refused to kneel. What began as Edward's campaign to end Scottish rebellion forever instead forged the very soul of a nation. The schiltrons that advanced through English cavalry charges became symbols of defiance that would inspire generations. The victory proved that no empire, however mighty, could extinguish the flame of freedom once it burned bright in the hearts of a people determined to be free. Bannockburn stands as more than a military triumph. It remains a testament to the power of unity, the importance of choosing your ground wisely, and the truth that sometimes the greatest victories come not from superior numbers, but from superior spirit. 7 centuries have passed since Bruce's axe split Henry de Bohun's helmet, but the lesson endures. When ordinary people fight for something greater than themselves, they can achieve the extraordinary. The miracle at Bannockburn reminds us that freedom is never given freely. It must be won, defended, and cherished by each generation willing to pay its price.